Can begin. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the purpose of this meeting is to put before you the current financial position of the university and some of the considerations that come from that. This is an open meeting. We've invited the press to be present. We've also arranged a press conference for 1:30 so that any questions they have, they can put at that point, and the question period here will be for members of the university. What I have to say will, in fact, be relatively short in order to leave a reasonable amount of time for questions. I think that everyone is aware of the broad outlines of the university's position, but I would like to present some of the details of that, which I don't think you will find surprising or inconsistent with what you know, but which may fill in some of the gaps, may be of interest to you individually, but I think may be particularly useful to you to the extent that you may have occasion to talk about the university and its situation to people outside. The university's basic financial position is that we have a deficit of $4.6 million from last year, from the end of the last financial year, and at the moment we are operating within the framework of a balanced budget for this year, but balanced only in the sense that the salary increases that have so far been provided for are a good deal below the levels that have been common elsewhere. Our position as a university is part of a university system, and we know very well that the university system is undergoing a considerable pressure, that government grants, which in Quebec up to this point have continued to rise in a more satisfactory manner to us than grants have risen in many other parts of North America, but suddenly grants have slowed down very considerably. That in itself is hardly surprising in these times, but the rate at which the government of Quebec has turned things around, the rate at which it is now trying to compress the whole university system in Quebec, has been a quite unrealistic one, with the result that all universities in Quebec are this year facing major financial difficulties and are taking various steps in the face of those problems. We, of course, don't expect that we can escape from what is happening generally, both in Quebec and outside of Quebec, but we do feel that there is a particular aspect to the situation of Concordia University. The fact that Concordia has always been less well-funded than other universities makes it particularly wrong and also particularly impossible to expect that we can reduce our operations at the same rate as is being expected elsewhere. And in order to illustrate just what that comparative position of Concordia University is, I have here a first transparency to be shown. One of these graphs is in actual dollars, the other in constant dollars, but they show essentially the same situation. Concordia University is the lowest line on the graph, which is what you would expect, I presume. The line, which is marked C, is the level of financing of all institutions in Quebec, and obviously we fall a great deal lower than that. The measurement which is used here is admissible expense per full-time equivalent student. In that term, there is contained a good deal of jargon, which I can go into later if that seems necessary. But for the moment, let us say that admissible expenditures, which is a term that's taken out of the governmental financing system, is the best measurement of the amount of money available to a university to spend on normal operating purposes. And by dividing that by the number of full-time equivalent students, we thereby take account of the mix of full-time and part-time students in this university and in other universities in the way that has long been accepted for grant calculating purposes in this province. So the comparison of line A and line C shows the extent of the underfunding of Concordia University, since there is no obvious reason why we should basically be funded less than other universities. We simply are, as things have evolved here in Quebec. Line B, however, is introduced to take account of the fact that some universities in Quebec have particularly expensive faculties, and medical faculties are the most obvious example of this. It might well be argued that Concordia should not expect to be financed at the same rate as universities with medical faculties. And basically, we accept that argument because certainly those faculties are much more expensive. But line B excludes universities that have faculties of medicine And since universities with faculties of medicine tend to be the ones that have the other expensive professional faculties as well, you might expect that line B would fall a good deal lower than line A. But you notice that in fact it doesn't. By and large, they fall at the same level, showing that in Quebec, other institutions that do not have faculties of medicine are also financed at a good deal higher level than Concordia University. So we really have reflected in this one graph the basic problem of the university that has existed for a good long time. Over the years, some adjustments have been made in Concordia's position. The gap may not be as great as it was 10 or 15 years ago, but the gap still remains a very substantial one. And our argument at the present time is that something should be done about closing that gap. We should not simply be expected to have the same percentage compression on our budgets as other institutions which have been a good deal better financed for a long time. The second transparency reflects much the same considerations, just expressed in a different form. The top line shows that we have had somewhere between 14 and 15% of the full-time equivalent students in Quebec. 14 to 15% of the students in Quebec have enrolled at Concordia University. Line B shows that somewhere between 9 and 10% of admissible expenses and therefore of government grants have come to Concordia University, since admissible expenses and government grants are in fact very closely related. Our admissible expenses are covered by tuition fees and government grants, so are those of other universities, and this really reflects the fact that the government has permitted us 10% in the share of expenditures of Quebec universities, while we have been looking after the needs of 15% of the students in Quebec universities. The transparencies that I've shown so far reflect the position of today and the past few years. The next one reflects the government's intentions for the next few years. This fall, the government of Quebec announced its general rules for university financing for the years from 1982-83 to 1984-85. The first line, 1981-82, is this year, and it shows that our budget for this year is $78.8 million. This table is in constant dollars, so it sets aside the questions of inflation and the indexing that will no doubt take place for inflation. But simply setting that aside, the government announced that it intended to compress the total envelope for university grants for all universities by 3.5%. in constant dollars in real terms for 1982-83. And then it also intended to remove a further 3% from the envelope, which would then be redistributed to the universities, particularly to look after those universities whose enrollment is expected to be growing. So it's on the basis of those figures that this table has been prepared, that we will have our share of the 3.5% cut in the total envelope. We may expect to get a small amount of that second 3% back because of the way in which the growth rate is calculated. We should have a small growth rate for grant purposes in 1982-83. But since other universities are growing much more rapidly than we are in Quebec at the present time, the French universities in particular, the probability is that they will get more of that money than we will. Anyway, simply making what inevitably has to be a kind of rough calculation at this stage as to what the distribution of monies will be, you find there the figures for 1982-83, and then for the last 2 years, where the percentages are somewhat different, but the direction is the same. Thus, what the government is asking of us, in effect, at this time, is to reduce our budget in constant dollars by the amounts that you see illustrated. And over a 3-year period, this is a very substantial reduction. This next graph, I think, will be reasonably familiar to most of you. It simply shows the growth of our enrollment over the last few years, measured in full-time equivalent students, and the distribution among the various faculties in the university. The point of this is that although our enrollment is now leveling off, that it has not, in fact, diminished very significantly as yet. In the later 1980s, no doubt our enrollment will drop, but as we go into this period of budgetary compression, we're not going into it at a time when our enrollments have been dropping fairly rapidly, and where therefore it might be thought relatively easy to squeeze some expenditures out. And this indicates the number of degrees that have been conferred annually over the last 5 years. In this particular case, I think it would have been more informative if the graph had gone back a few years earlier, because if that had happened, you would find that our number of students graduated had increased regularly for a good many years prior to what you find on the graph. It reached a certain peak, but since then it has leveled off. So again, the point of this is that we are graduating some 3,000 individuals each year from Concordia University, and this is a rate which has stopped growing, naturally enough, since that period is over, but which still remains remarkably constant. And this graph indicates one of the areas of considerable success of the university. We may have other areas of success, but this one is easily quantified and put on a graph. The growth in research funds awarded to Concordia over the last several years, which again indicates that the university has, in fact, been developing, and in this particular area, developing at a very substantial pace. Coming back to the comparisons of Concordia with other universities in the system, this graph attempts to compare Concordia's situation, indicated by A, the pink color, with other universities, indicated by B, the green column. What is measured here is full-time equivalent personnel per 1,000 full-time equivalent students. Since we have part-time personnel and part-time students, this complicates making such comparisons. The way of dealing with this is to reduce both of those measures to a full-time equivalent, and this shows that in the case of Concordia, for faculty, graph A, we have, it would look like something of the order of 45 full-time equivalent faculty members for every 1,000 full-time equivalent students in this university, whereas in other universities in Quebec, they have something like 65 full-time equivalent faculty for every 1,000 full-time equivalent students. Now, since the underfunding of Concordia University has to show up somewhere, obviously, this is one of the evident places in which it shows up. We simply have a smaller number of faculty and a smaller number of support staff per student or per 1,000 students than is the case in other universities. And this indicates, I think, well, the problems that Concordia has in facing a period of budgetary cutbacks, that we simply start with far fewer personnel than other universities are starting with, and in consequence, the process of cutting back is correspondingly more difficult to contemplate here. And to complete this series of transparencies, I would simply like to show once again the first one, which is the key one and which is the summary statement that shows where our level of expenditures as approved by the government and financed through government grants is in relationship to the level of expenditures that are permitted to other universities in Quebec. Well, so much for statistical comparisons. To turn now to our situation in the present year, I would ask you to cast your minds back to round about the month of June, which is the period in which our financial year begins, and the period in which the framework for this year's finances were put into place. You'll remember that we had, at that time, just prior to June, in fact, a committee whose responsibility was to examine all aspects of the university's budget and to propose to the university how we could make $3 million in budget cuts. That committee made its report, and the report has been essentially implemented so that the budget for this year has already been reduced by $3 million, which is, in the budget which would otherwise have been of the order of $80 million, is a fairly substantial cut, a fairly significant one, and one I think we should recognize and not tend to forget. These things tend to pass into history very rapidly, but we are still living in the financial year that those cuts were put into effect, and they were indeed significant and substantial. They have led to a reduction in the level of services in this university, which is quite significant. It is a reduction of services that took place after an examination of the various areas, of the various services, and it therefore represents the considered opinion of that committee and of the university that this was the degree of cutback, and those were the areas of cutback where we, all things considered, could best absorb the impact. It was also the opinion of those who were engaged in that exercise that it would not be possible simply to do the same thing over again, that we couldn't at some future time simply have another committee and say save another $3 million by repeating the same kind of exercise. We have already cut sharply and significantly into the level of services, trying to do so where it would hurt least, but nevertheless hurt, and any attempt to repeat that kind of exercise will turn out to hurt a good deal more, and the effect on the university will be a good deal more dangerous. In the area of salaries, for those members of staff who are not involved in a union agreement, either present or future, salaries were increased for June by 6.7% on an interim basis. In the case of other staff, the salary treatment is a matter of negotiation and is or will be the result of agreements to be negotiated or that have been negotiated in the past. The reason that the figure was 6.7% in June and not 8% and not 5% or some other figure is that in the circumstances of that time, that was the amount of money which the university had available on the basis of cutting its budget by the $3 million already mentioned, and thereafter having a break-even budget for the year 1981-82. This was our policy at that point, to preserve our options for the future by maintaining a balanced budget. That decision is subject to re-examination and subject to negotiation in the weeks and months that were to follow June and still to follow where we are now. But the basic position which the university has taken for 1981-82 is that we should balance our budget for this year rather than starting off the year with a substantial deficit which would inevitably end up being carried over into future years. And our current position is the logical outcome of the decisions that were taken then. There was defined in June a level of services which we felt it necessary to maintain through the 1981-82 financial year. And our policy at this moment is still to continue maintaining that level of services. There have been some adjustments to the grants, and some things have become clearer than they were in June, which may very well lead to the possibility of some increase in salaries above the level of 6.7%. But there has so far occurred nothing which would put us into a position to pay the amounts included in the Parizeau formula. But I repeat, exactly what is to be done or will happen is a matter for continuing re-examination and for negotiation. And I'm not in a position to make a statement that this is exactly what will happen with respect to salaries. The point that we are at now, and in a way I think this is the core point of the meeting, is that we must call upon the Department of Education and the Government of Quebec to make an adjustment to our grants, which will, I am sure, under any conceivable circumstances, not end up putting us on easy street, but which will be a recognition of the facts that are shown in this transparency, which is still being projected, that the level of financing of Concordia University is far less than the level of financing of other universities in the system. When in 1981-82 the government for the first time in real earnest in this province decided that it had to, for financial reasons, cut back on grants to universities, in the first instance it did so essentially right across the board, cutting all universities by equivalent percentages. And then in the second instance, it made particular provisions in the grant formula for those universities whose enrollment is growing more rapidly than others. Now, the reason for that is quite understandable, since such universities have particular additional expenses to cope with. But the effect of that particular priority in the government system is to squeeze a university like ourselves, which is not among the most rapidly growing universities in the province for the present grant period. When a university is growing, the Quebec grant system squeezes out some additional money for it. As growth slows down, the pressures on an underfunded university like Concordia become that much greater. And the position which this university must take at the present time is to call on the government to recognize this inequity in the grant system and in the distribution of grants, and to make an adjustment to our grant. Now, we know fully well that the government of Quebec is short of money these days. And we're not at all surprised to find that the government of Quebec has, later than many other provinces in Canada reached the point of deciding that it must control the growth of university grants. But nevertheless, the government and the Department of Education does have some flexibility in its grant system. It does have some reserves which can be made available in special circumstances. The government has, in fact, chosen to use that flexibility for the benefit of the Université de Québec à Montréal, which had a particular problem related to the fact that its rate of growth has been fantastically more rapid than that of other universities in Quebec. And the government has seen fit to provide some special assistance for the University of Quebec in Montreal. So, if that principle can be applied to one institution, presumably that principle can be applied to Concordia University, and it is reasonable for us to expect that the government will make some adjustment. So that this is a time in the development of our situation for us to emphasize our special position. We have had and we will continue to have opportunities to join with other universities in protesting the extraordinary speed with which the government of Quebec is trying to roll back in constant dollars the entire university system. But the point that I'm emphasizing today is, be that general principle as it may, there is a specific problem and a specific case for Concordia University that should be addressed by the government at this time. And we, I think, have to make that point very clearly, because I don't think anybody else is very likely to make it on our behalf. And it seems to be the key point to our immediate situation. And since we are in the situation that is reflected on the graph being projected, we cannot at this time enter upon the kind of reductions in services that some other universities are already undertaking. The fact is that our level of services has always been lower than that available in other universities. We have already reduced our services in terms of the $3 million worth of budget cuts. And to expect us again at this point to enter into a further round of reductions in the level and quality of our services is unrealistic, inequitable, and unjust. This is a period which is certainly not going to be an easy one for anyone in the university to live through. It's a period that will call for steady nerves on our part. It would be too easy either to give way to pessimism, to say that the government of Quebec doesn't have any money anyway, or that for one reason or another they're not likely to give whatever money they do have to us. I think it would be premature to take that kind of pessimistic position. We do know that while the government of Quebec is certainly in a difficult financial situation, it does have some flexibility within the framework of the university grants, and it can certainly, if it sees fit to do so, make an adjustment which would be very significant in terms of our financial problem. So it's not a time to simply say nothing can be done or nothing can possibly happen. But on the other hand, it's not a time to cling to a position of business as usual. to assume that we can simply continue to spend at what has been our current levels, to, if necessary, run up budget deficits in the expectation that sooner or later the budget deficits will be looked after. It is a period where we have to press our case vigorously with the government, but at the same time to follow a prudent policy of maintaining our options so that when we do get whatever adjustment we do ultimately obtain from government, we can adjust our spending accordingly, rather than to be perennially in the situation of having massive deficits and attempting to have those deficits covered from elsewhere. It is certainly a period for realism, because even after an adjustment to our grants that I think we deserve and should get, things will still be tight. We will not be placed on easy street. The government's intent is to continue to squeeze the university system as a whole for the next 3 years, and we will undoubtedly be caught up in those squeezes to greater or lesser degree. The point is that it should be to a lesser degree until our basic financing coincides with the basic financing of other universities in this province. At that point, and only at that point, would it be reasonable to expect this university to accept a compression in its budget equivalent in percentage terms to those that are being asked elsewhere. So this is the stage we are at the moment. This is not a day on which there are final answers to be given about our position, or even about our 1981-82 budget. The political process is unhappily a long one, and it takes time, often considerable time, to present these issues to government and to get government action and reaction. But I think we have no other acceptable alternative than to pursue this route. I am sure the government would be delighted to see us accept the principle that we should be in the same boat as the other universities, and to be contemplating cutting out this program or reducing that service in order to meet the figures which they hold up as targets. But this is not the situation we're in, and I think that at this moment this is what we have to pursue. So much for my remarks. As I said, I intended to leave some time for questions, and there are 2 microphones at the top of the 2 aisles. We'll take people starting with the microphone on my right at this side, and then simply alternate between the 2 microphones for whatever time there may be. Yes.
Okay. Dr. O'Brien, you use terms such as we must call upon the Department of Education and the Government of Quebec, and we must press our case vigorously to the government. But historically, Concordia University, particularly the administration, hasn't done this. And we think that as far as the students are concerned, we've thought that this is basically why the government has been squeezing us like they have for the past so many years. What I myself would like to know, and I'm sure that the faculty, the students, the staff, and the library workers would like to know, is if the students, staff, faculty, and library workers decided to close down this university to show the government our united confrontation or our united protest to the situation they've been putting to us for the past so many years, would you and your administration be willing to back us in that protest to begin the long-awaited response from the university community from Concordia?
That's a good question, and there is not a simple answer to that, because it depends on the particular build-up to such a gesture. It depends on the particular day. We have seen that kind of gesture undertaken in some institutions in Quebec. The results of it have sometimes been effective. The results in other cases have not been effective. There may well be a moment at which it is appropriate to make that kind of a gesture, but it will require a pretty high order of judgment to decide what the day is and what the procedure should be. So my simple answer to a complicated question is that day may very well come, but if your question is today or this week the time, I would say no. Yes.
Rector O'Brien, at this university here, we have a graduate business school which produces the second highest GMAT scores in entire North America. We have an engineering faculty which is considered the third in the country, which from its record for research grants is fast becoming the first in the country. We have a Department of Science which is able to get the very important laser research grant. In short, we have one of the best universities in this country. Also, besides having very many full-time students, we are the preeminent part-time and evening university in this entire country. The Ministry of Education knows who we are. They know that we are the most efficient university. I've seen the cabinet documents that they have say we are the most efficient university, but they are willing to keep on squeezing us because we're willing to continue being squeezed. The time for restraint has finished. With those documents you showed, with 4 years from now, our funding being down to $68 million, what is our current wage bill? We won't even be able to cover our own wage bill. On November 27th at 9 a.m., Monsieur Laurent is going to be at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, along with 6, I believe it is, representatives of the university communities, as well as students. They will be discussing university financing. What is the administration going to tell them? Is the administration of this university going to say, squeeze us some more, we can take it? Or is the administration of this university going to say, our students, our staff, our faculty are damn proud of us, and we're worried about our very existence. We will not take any more.
How Mr. Laurent's ateliers are going to work out is a major mystery at the present time. One of the 4 ateliers is on financing. The working papers for the atelier have been drafted clearly with an eye to excluding the level of the government support for the universities as the core item in the atelier. On the other hand, when you have an atelier which is called finance in the present circumstances, it seems to me rather difficult that one is going to be able to exclude that question. Certainly the concern of all the universities, the overriding concern of all the universities at the present time under the heading of finance is the level of expenditure. And certainly in one form or another, I am pretty sure that is going to end up being put on the table at that atelier. Yes?
Dr. O'Brien, if I've understood your remarks correctly, you're proposing that the university deal with this, I think we can agree on calling it upcoming financial crisis, if not the present one, in 2 ways. That we ask the government to redress the long-standing disparity, or if not completely redress it, at least do something about the long-standing disparity between the per capita grant to Concordia versus other universities in the province. That is, that we do this speaking on behalf of Concordia itself, and that in concert with other universities we otherwise protest the if not the government cutbacks per se, at least the schedule of those cutbacks, or effective cutbacks in real dollars, that is. My question to you is a two-part one addressed to that alternative approach to the problem. The first question is, what would you say the chances of success are vis-a-vis a request to the government to address the disparity, etc., on the basis of the past attempts, if any, to achieve such a redress? Perhaps I should pause there before I come to the second part of my question, or if you want, I can give you the
Well,
second
let me
part
answer
now.
that and then give the second part. The history of this matter is that this gap has existed for a long time. About 3-4 years ago, the Department of Education finally recognized that there was a gap. And at that time, 3 or 4 years ago, they did make an adjustment that certainly was a small one relative to the size of the gap, but which was a large and significant one in absolute terms of the amount of money that it involved. Since that time, they have not made any further adjustment, and in some ways the grant system has worked to our disadvantage. But the point in answer to your question, I think, is that the Department of Education has recognized in principle that we have a case. Now, in principle has to be changed into some actual money before it is of any real help. But the fact that they recognized relatively recently that there is a case in principle, and that they did make one adjustment relatively recently, indicates, I think, that there is a reasonable chance that they would now make a second adjustment. I don't think that there's any chance of expecting that in one fell swoop a gap as large as the one we're talking about is going to be closed. But I don't see any reason why we would not have every right to expect that there be a significant move to make that gap smaller, and then in a subsequent year there be further moves to make that gap still smaller. You had a second part.
Yes, the second part of my question is addressed to what you're saying Concordia is going to do in concert with the other universities in the province. It seems to me that the first step that you're proposing, that is this special appeal to the government on behalf of the financial injustice that has been inflicted on Concordia, could be interpreted as an instance of what I think to some extent otherwise can properly be seen as an attempt on the part of just about all of the universities in this province faced with this financial squeeze to scramble for themselves and try to negotiate the best possible deal for themselves, even if it means cutting another university's throat or stabbing all the other universities in the back. And therefore, when you say that the only concerted course of action on Concordia's agenda is to protest to the government the rate of these cutbacks, that can perhaps be said to be not very much in the way of concerted action. So in short, the second part of my question is there anything more that Concordia is proposing to do, or indeed can you enlighten us generally on what degree of concerted action there is, if any, among the universities in this province in the way of offering something constructive, as for example, it would seem from the lucid outline that you gave.
What is the question?
It would seem from the outline that you gave with your graphs and so forth that Concordia's financial difficulties would be more than met if For example, the proposed tuition increases, that is, the tuition increases that have been rooted, were phased in over, not all at once, but over a period of even the next 3 or 4 years. Is there any agreement on the part of the universities in this province to support something like that, given, as you say, that the government is itself in something of a financial bind?
Well, if your question is mainly about tuition increases,
No, it's mainly about what other kinds of concerted action aside from protest Concordia is willing to support or even take the lead in.
All right, you point at something that is true and is important. Why should Concordia's protests be taken as any different from the protests from various other universities that they too are in financial trouble? In most circumstances, I am sure that would be the reaction of the general public or the government, which hears protests about financial problems in the parapublic sector so often that it's become rather inured to them. The fact, nevertheless, is that our position is different. Okay, we say so, but why should anybody else agree? The reason anybody else should agree is that it has also been said by the Council of Universities of Quebec, which is an official advisory body to the Minister of Education, that Concordia's position is different. It has been recognized by the Department of Education itself that Concordia's position is different. And I think I might even go so far as to say that it has been recognized by other universities that our position is different. Now, I don't think we can realistically expect other universities to come and support our case when they have problems of their own. But the point indeed is that we must get the message across that our case is different. It's not just one more institution complaining about being short of money. To the extent that we succeed in doing that, we have good backing for it, because there are these official government documents from the governmental circles that indicate, that recognize that our case is different. So we do have some